Hey everybody, this is John Rosania, and I'm here with Drew Perowit. Everybody falls off track with their health at some point. I do, Drew does, Dr. Younger does. The question isn't if we're going to fall off track, it's when. And so it's best to be prepared for that. In our community, one of the areas that people tend to get thrown off is around this issue of emotional eating. So last week, Drew, myself, and Dr. Younger addressed the cycle of emotional eating on one of our live calls.
Yeah, John, I think one of the keys with the cycle and in health in general is that sometimes in health we get stuck. And when we get stuck, it can feel that we don't know enough information, and that's why we're stuck. But most of the times when we get stuck, it has nothing to do with not knowing what to do. We know what to do, we're just not doing it. Then the question becomes, why are we stuck?
And so we wanted to take a little bit of time today to look at very closely the cycle of emotional eating. And when we get a really good awareness of this, we'll notice it in our life more, and it'll start to have less power over us. So Drew, let's get right into it.
Yeah, for sure. The cycle of emotional eating has four main parts. We'll give a little overview and then we'll chat about each one. So first is the trigger/emotional response. Think of this as a stressful or slightly traumatic event that might happen in your life, like a breakup or a really stressful day at work or an email that you get from somebody or just really negative thoughts that you have about yourself that you internalize. The key is that you internalize it and that you haven't dealt with it directly. When that happens, because that energy is inside of us, we sometimes, with food, with other stimulants in our life, for some people alcohol, for some people drugs, for some people sex, whatever it might be, but in this case we're talking about food, we make the decision to cover up that uncomfortable feeling. With the case of food, we often do that with fatty, sugary foods that really occupy a lot of digestive energy. After the cover-up ends up happening, it puts us in an initial phase where we have a sense of false bliss. You know, after you eat that big bowl of ice cream, immediately you're high off of that processed sugar and feel really sort of comforted, quote unquote, by the dairy and the other heavy ingredients that are inside of it. And there's a little high that comes from it that reinforces the decision to cover it up from the first place. But that high never lasts, and it leads to the next thing, which is what we call the hangover. The hangover is both physical and emotional. The physical pain comes from often eating things that we know don't work for us, really heavy, sugary, fatty foods that we often reach to in a stressful situation. And the emotional aspect of it is we feel guilty for falling off track. And that guilt and that shame, along with the physical discomfort, leads to a new trigger or emotional response happening, which then continues the cycle overall.
So Drew, because the trigger is in some ways the most powerful part, it's what gets us into the cycle and then continues the cycle. Can we just go a little bit more in depth just about the trigger? I know you've said before that what a trigger is for you could be very different than what a trigger is for me.
Yeah, John, everybody has different triggers, and your triggers are based on your insecurities, old stuff that you had or internalized when you were a kid from stressful situations. So for some people, insecurity could be that I'm not enough, that I'm not loved. So let's say if you have an insecurity from the time that you were young that you're not loved, and you find yourself in a situation where your partner, let's say your husband or your wife, does something where they don't tell you straight up that you're not loved, but their actions have you internalize it as if your understanding from it is you're not loved.
Could you give us a little example of how that might show up?
Yeah, for sure. So you may planned in a very elaborate weekend, a romantic weekend with your partner, and then you get an email from them because they have a very stressful day at work saying, hey, I can't make it this weekend. Let's just talk about it a little later on today. But they don't give you any explanation. They don't go into anything for it. Now, sometimes we apply a story to that. So the story could be, oh, they don't love me, and nobody loves me. And it reminds you of all these past things. It doesn't happen consciously. It usually happens in the background. You just sort of feel it. And that's what insecurity is. When you feel that and you don't deal with it directly, maybe by calling them or going for a walk or really understanding what it is you feel, it's so easy to cover up those uncomfortable feelings with some form of food.
Absolutely. So now we know that the trigger can be almost anything, and you've addressed one of the ways of beginning to break free from that, let's go a little bit more in depth into the cover up and the false bliss section. And I just want to kind of share a little bit about how when we do cover it up, especially with food, Drew mentioned how we tend to go to fatty or sugary types foods. And these foods literally, as they're called comfort foods, these foods literally suck energy from our nervous system and pull it all to the digestive process. And in that process there, we tend to not feel as much. We literally numb ourselves. And it's a deep process, and it's one that we can get caught in very easily. And once that false bliss starts to wear off, then we come into the hangover.
Yeah, the hangover is so key because the comfort foods that we often seek don't leave us feeling comfortable. And very few people really talk about that, but everybody feels it. You eat that big sandwich that has tons of gluten and dairy and maybe fried stuff inside of it. We're not here to judge what's there. We're simply talking about the fact that a lot of the foods that we end up reaching for to cover us, to cover things up, have us feel like crap later on. We feel bloated. We feel constipated. We feel the energy really sucked out of us and feel drained throughout the day. So that's the first aspect. And as I mentioned previously, the second aspect of the hangover, right? Yeah, just in the same way that somebody might have a hangover after a really wild night of drinking. The second aspect is this feeling of regret and shame. Shame is this idea that, you know what, I did this again. I shouldn't have done it. Something's wrong with me, right? So the guilt and shame that comes with the hangover often creates enough momentum that it creates a new trigger. You find this a lot when people initially in the beginning part of the year are very excited to exercise. They miss a couple of days because they have this all or nothing mentality. And immediately after missing those days, they come back home and they're like, oh my God, see, here you are again. You made another New Year's resolution and you messed up. You're never going to get this right. And it's that talk and conversation that happens in our mind that creates future triggers. And another trigger leads to what we call a cycle, because then it creates another cover up, another false bliss, and a hangover after that.
One of the reasons why we wanted to name each part of these sections is so that when you're in your daily life, you can sort of call them out. You can find we're all going to get stuck in this cycle eventually. And so you know that, okay, maybe you missed the trigger, but now you're in the cover up and you're starting to eat unconsciously. And you say, there it is. I'm in the cover up. Or, I'm in that false bliss moment, and now I'm kind of deeply in the hangover. The more and more we can bring awareness to this, the more and more we can interrupt this cycle. And that's where we're kind of heading to the next point of what do we do once we understand the cycle and we're in the midst of it? How do we break free?
Yeah, breaking free is all about awareness. It's funny that, if you listen to most health books out there today, you think that as long as you eat exactly what you need to eat, everything else will be okay. Well, we know here at Clean, and you know as well too in your own life, is you could be doing everything perfectly in terms of the recipes or what you put in your mouth, but still not be in a great state of health because of your thoughts and ideas about it. So really the key is with anything in life that's a pattern, that's negative, that doesn't serve us. The key is breaking free. So as we mentioned, John, the first thing is awareness, noticing this is going on, and then deciding to do something about it. So when you decide to do something about it, that might mean instead of covering it up, dealing with the issue directly. If your spouse canceled on you last minute without an explanation, it might mean just a quick call to them and saying, hey, listen, this is what I'm feeling right now. I'm feeling a little bit of like it was a short response and some stuff came up for me. Can we talk about this real quick and just sort of see where you're at and where I'm at? That's one of the best ways to address it.
I actually think that one is so powerful that it can almost immediately dissolve whatever that craving was from before. It's a really powerful one.
Yeah, and then, John, we also have this idea of building a healthy toolbox of habits that people can use to interrupt the cycle as well.
Yeah, so this is definitely one where if you habitually get into the process of when you start to feel these states coming on or you start to notice them, you have this sort of healthy toolbox you can go to. And some of our favorites are taking a long walk, drinking some water, resting. So we have a whole list and more about how to break free from the cycle in our podcast that you can listen to. And then,
two things. First of all, we go in depth in this topic in the book Clean Gut, which will be coming out on April 30th. It's by Dr. Younger, and we'll put a little pre-order link to it here in the newsletter and in the comments section. So just wanted to give a little plug for that. But additionally, this is a very big and heavy topic. And just listening to this video is not meant to address the situation completely for the rest of your life. Really what we're trying to do is we're trying to start the conversation, bring awareness to this, and then leave you with some places to go a little deeper. We feel really it would be a disservice if we didn't at least acknowledge the fact that this is often the thing that trips people up with their health and when they get caught up in a downward cycle. So lastly, just a couple books that we recommend if you want to look into this a little further and getting to the root of why these issues come up, where these insecurities come from. One of our favorite books is a book by Byron Katie called Loving What Is. John, do you have any other recommendations?
Yeah, one of my favorites is the book Radical Honesty by Brad Blanton, and then also a colleague of his, a psychotherapist in San Francisco, a book called Getting Real by Susan Campbell.
All great recommendations. And again, this is just to start the conversation. Let us know what you think. Have you ever found yourself in the cycle of emotional eating? Where do you get the most tripped up? If you respond back to our newsletter email, we'll take your questions from there.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.